March 24, 1873. A full 15 years before Jack the Ripper would unleash his Whitechapel reign of terror, dawn breaks over Durham jail. Inside the thick stone walls, a 40-year-old woman stands on the gallows, a noose draped around her neck. Her name is Maryanne Cotton, one of the most infamous women in Victorian England. In moments, the lever will be pulled. A crowd has gathered beyond the prison gates, braving a cold spring morning for a glimpse of justice. It is only a few years since executions stopped being a public spectacle. Some of those outside have lost loved ones under mysterious circumstances. Others are simply drawn by morbid curiosity. There is a hush as the prison bell tolls the hour. The executioner, a bit of a celebrity in his own right and famous for making his subjects suffer, releases the trapdoor. Maryanne drops, but not far enough. The rope snaps taut, but her neck does not break. For 3 long minutes, she writhes and gasps, and the hangman is forced to press down on her shoulders to hasten her end. At last, Maryanne Cotton becomes still. Britain's first female serial killer is no more. In the awful stillness after the execution, one question remains. How could a seemingly respectable woman, a nurse, a wife, a mother of 13 children, come to such an end? Leaving a heart-rending trail of up to 21 victims behind her, using my background as a forensic psychiatrist, I will be exploring how a humble miner's daughter could learn to kill and kill again to become Britain's first female serial killer. Our journey begins in the coal mines and crowded cottages of northeast England in the mid-19th century. William IV was on the throne and the nation was busy fighting colonial wars in Malaya, Africa, India, and Jamaica. A child was born on Halloween in 1832 in the village of Lom Mosley, County Durham, Maryanne Robson. Her father, Michael, was a colliery sinker, a specialist miner who dug the deep shafts for the 200 or so pits in the county. Maryanne entered a world of grime and poverty. Wages were low and conditions in the mines were poor, with accidents commonplace. A quarter of miners didn't make it past their 35th birthday. Those that survived had the prospect of chronic lung diseases to look forward to. The village of Lom Mosley was a pit village. The North Hayton Colliery was sunk in 1826 and employed 500 men underground, kneeling in tunnels 3 feet 6 inches high, hacking away at the seams with picks in almost complete darkness for 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. One of the few perks of the job was having a company-owned cottage to live in, providing the man of the house remained fit and able to work. Infectious diseases were common, and when Maryanne was just a toddler, her youngest sister Margaret died. An early lesson that life in Victorian England could be brutally short. Her father was a devout Methodist and raised his family with strict discipline. But when Maryanne was 9, he was working on a new mine at Merton Colliery. At 226 fathoms or 413 meters, it was one of the deepest in the country. And in its 150 years of operation, it claimed the lives of almost 400 men. When Michael Robson fell 150 feet down a shaft to his death, he became one of the first. His body was brought home by his fellow miners in a Hessian sack marked, property of the South Hetton Coal Company. One can only imagine the impact on a young girl of seeing her father's remains delivered home so unceremoniously, and of a proud man, or what was left of him, being so emphatically stamped as company property. I don't think you have to be a psychiatrist to imagine the kind of psychological scar this must have left on Maryanne. Some have speculated that the experience hardened her heart and allowed her to distance herself from the emotion of death and become a serial killer. But her experience was not unusual. There were around 1,000 such accidents every year in the UK, and just as many in other countries. Probably more, as proper records were not even kept at first. 1,000 sackfuls of snuffed-out lives delivered to stunned wives, parents, and children every year. But only Maryanne Cotton went on to kill. The shock of her father's death was compounded by the immediate threat of homelessness. After a fatal accident, coal companies would routinely evict families from a tied house to give it to someone capable of working, sometimes after just a month. So Maryanne's mother, with no income and 2 children to care for, had little choice but to remarry as soon as possible to ensure they had a roof over their heads. Her second husband was another pitman who, by all accounts, was just as strict as her first. Although many mining villages had schools, these tended to come later, and most working-class children had to work. There were ragged schools for the poor, and we know that Maryanne attended a Wesleyan Sunday school, and the superintendent described her as a most exemplary and regular attender. A girl of innocent disposition and average intelligence, distinguished for her particularly clean and tidy appearance. No signs yet of Maryanne, the dark angel of County Durham. At the age of 16, Maryanne left to work as a nursemaid for the children of a colliery manager in a nearby village. But after they were sent off to boarding school, she returned home to her mother where she trained as a dressmaker. In 1852, 20-year-old Maryanne, already pregnant, got married for the first time at a registry office in Newcastle. Her husband, William Mobbery, was a labourer, a colliery fireman, and sometime miner, a solid enough man a few years her senior. A good match, people would have said, and seeking better prospects. The couple moved south to Plymouth in southwest England. We don't know why they moved. Maybe they were just trying to get away from the mines. And Plymouth was a bit of a boom town with a naval dockyard servicing Britain's enormous fleet, and it was a major embarkation point for those seeking new opportunities in the colonies. We do know, however, that Maryanne was extraordinarily fertile. Over the next 10 to 12 years, she had at least 7 and possibly 9 children. The exact number is uncertain, as although registering births and deaths was meant to be compulsory, it was not enforced. What is clear, though, is that most of her children did not survive infancy. Those deaths that were recorded were put down to gastric fever, a commonly used but non-specific term for the gastrointestinal ailments that were all too common in Victorian England, where poor sanitation and contaminated water contributed to the fearful statistic that 1 in 3 children did not make it to their 5th birthday. So whilst the endless procession of little coffins emerging from the Mobberys' various houses might have seemed a bit unusual, it wouldn't have been unusual enough to raise suspicions of foul play. But knowing what she did later raises the distinct possibility that rather than succumbing to the symptoms of gastric fever, vomiting, diarrhea, and stomach pains, it's possible she had already begun her merciless killing career by poisoning her own children with arsenic. By 1856, they had returned to the north, settling in Hendon, a shipbuilding and industrial area of Sunderland. It was around this time, after losing most of his offspring, that William Mobbery decided to take out a life insurance policy covering both himself and their remaining children. Such policies were very popular. Victorian insurance salesmen, the men from the Prudential, targeted working-class families, offering peace of mind for a few pennies a week if any insured family member died. A modest payout would cover burial costs and tide the survivors over for a few months. The insurance company didn't make much profit from the Mobberys, however. By the end of 1864, only 2 of their 7, 8, or 9 children were still breathing, and in January the following year, William Mobbery also became ill and died. The official cause was an intestinal disorder, the same gastric symptoms that had claimed so many of the Mobbery children. William was around 39 years old, and while his death raised no immediate alarms, his doctor remarked that it was surprising how quickly he succumbed, given that he was in good health prior to his stomach upset. The grieving widow collected $35 from William's insurance policy, about a year's wages. She also received a smaller payout of 25 shillings for the death of their young son John, or 11 using the exchange rate of the time. Most people conclude that William, and at least some of their children, were Maryanne's first victims, but their deaths were never investigated. They were never tested for arsenic, and she was never charged with any crimes. If they were indeed her first victims, Maryanne Mobbery, as she still was at that point, got away with murder and earned herself a nice bit of money for her efforts. Some of her neighbors later commented that Maryanne seemed oddly composed in the face of all these tragedies. There were whispers that she was a cold woman, perhaps even too cold. But Victorian society expected widows to bear their grief with stoicism. So Maryanne's stiff upper lip did not immediately mark her out as suspicious. Callous unemotionality is a feature of the modern concept of psychopathy, and her coldness at this time may have been an indication of this trait. Criminologists have debated her motives and wondered if her killings were purely for the insurance payouts, a mercenary black widow spinning webs of death for financial gain, or was she driven by a pathological need to be rid of encumbrances to allow her to start life anew over and over again? Or was it a power thing, getting a buzz from having the power of life and death? Or was she a so-called angel of death, a woman who kills in the belief they are sparing suffering and acting out of mercy? As a forensic psychiatrist, I've spoken to many people who have taken the lives of others in all sorts of circumstances, some with mental disorders and some without. And in my experience, the reasons are usually complex with intertwined roots in their genetic inheritance, childhood traumas, and life experiences. It is rarely down to a single identifiable factor. What we do know is that the 35 from the insurance company would not have lasted long, and Maryanne faced an uncertain future with no husband, 2 daughters to support, and few respectable options for earning a living on her own. She moved to Seaham Harbour, a small town a few miles down the coast, where she rekindled a romance with an old flame, Joseph Natras. But as he was engaged to someone else, their liaison didn't last long, and tragedy soon struck again. One of her 2 remaining daughters, Margaret, just 3 years old, died of typhus in 1865. Typhus, not to be confused with typhoid, is an infectious bacterial disease spread by body lice. It begins with flu-like symptoms and a characteristic rash, and untreated, it can progress to inflammation of the brain, meningoencephalitis, confusion, delirium, and death. It was common in the 19th century and was responsible for tens of thousands of deaths in the Great Irish Famine. The signs of the disease would have been very familiar to doctors at the time. So little Margaret was probably not one of her mother's victims. Next, she moved to the industrial city of Sunderland, where she found work as a nurse at the wonderfully named Sunderland Infirmary, Dispensary, and House of Recovery for the cure of contagious fever. Nursing as a profession was still very much in its infancy. Florence Nightingale, shocked by the terrible conditions in the Crimean War, had established the first training school for nurses at St. Thomas's Hospital just a few years before in 1860. But most nurses at this time were still untrained, poorly educated, and poorly paid. Maryanne would have been expected to work long hours at back-breaking work, so she sent her only surviving child, Isabella, to live with her mother. But she soon latched onto one of her patients, George Ward, a gentle but sickly soul, partially paralyzed and suffering from intestinal problems, an easy target. They were soon in a relationship, and in August 1865, just 7 months after William Mowbray's demise, she became Mrs. Maryanne Ward. George's health never fully recovered. Over the next year, his condition inexplicably worsened. He was attended by a doctor throughout his decline, but his final downturn was unexpectedly sudden, and after just 14 months of marital bliss, George Ward died. The official causes were English cholera and typhoid. Typhoid is another infectious bacterial disease that was common in Victorian England. It begins with a high fever accompanied by weakness, headaches, abdominal pain, vomiting, and diarrhea. Like typhus, it may cause a rash and it may go on to affect the brain, and up to 20% of cases died. The abdominal pain, vomiting, and diarrhea that occur with arsenic poisoning would be difficult to distinguish from typhoid. Cholera is now used to refer to an infection with the bacterium Vibrio, but in the 19th century, cholera meant any gastrointestinal disease that resulted in yellow diarrhea. When the much more virulent Asiatic version of the disease arrived in Britain, the milder form was referred to as cholera morbus or English cholera, and this too would have been very difficult to distinguish from arsenic poisoning. Maryanne's reaction to George Ward's death was the same as ever. She coolly collected the insurance payout and moved on without batting an eyelid. It seemed she was getting more confident. Even though George's doctor thought his death unusually sudden, no inquiries were made. In the Victorian era, post-mortem examinations were not routinely performed unless there was a strong suspicion of foul play. It was time to move on again, and Maryanne soon found employment as a housekeeper to James Robinson, a shipwright and a recent widower living in Palliant, to look after his 5 children. But within a month of her arrival, Robinson's youngest son, still a baby, died suddenly of gastric fever. Maryanne used her charms to comfort James Robinson in his grief and was soon pregnant by him. Before they could marry, however, Maryanne was called away to attend to her own mother, who was ill with hepatitis. With her dutiful daughter looking after her, she would soon be better, surely. And she did improve initially, but within days of seeming to be on the mend, she suddenly relapsed with stomach pains like those that had felled so many others who had been close to her. And like the others, she died 9 days after her daughter came to stay. It was later noted that Margaret's tea tasted strangely bitter before her death. Arsenic is usually tasteless, but it can leave a metallic taste at high concentrations. So either her mother's tea merchant was guilty of passing on some dodgy tea leaves, or Maryanne poisoned her own mother and made sure it was quick by using a high concentration. The poisonous compounds of arsenic are still used in the manufacture of electronics, batteries, and glass. But in the Victorian era, it was everywhere. Although its toxicity had long been recognized, it was used as a beauty product and in dozens of medicinal compounds purporting to treat everything from epilepsy, hysteria, melancholia, dropsy, rickets, malaria, ulcers, syphilis, cancer, and worms. Oh yes, and all kinds of stomach ailments. It was used as a dye for fabrics and carpets, as an insecticide, and would have been available at every corner chemist as rat poison. It was cheap, odorless, normally tasteless, and dissolved easily in food or tea. The perfect weapon for anyone with evil intent. At the time, no one questioned Margaret's death. At 54, she was not young and had been ill. But if Maryanne did indeed kill her mother, it represented a chilling new crossing of lines, murdering the very woman who had given birth to her, fed her, raised her, and protected her. It suggests a complete lack of the normal emotional bonds between a daughter and her mother. For Maryanne, it seems that no one who stood in her way was safe. With her mother gone, Maryanne returned to the Robinson home, bringing along her only surviving child, Isabella, from her first marriage, who had managed to get to the age of 7 under the care of her grandmother. But back with her birth mother, she didn't last long. Within weeks, she too was dead of gastric fever, and Maryanne was again collecting from the insurance company. Maryanne was getting into her stride now, and in the same terrible month, 2 of James Robinson's children also died of stomach ailments. 3 children in one household gone in a matter of days. One can only imagine James Robinson's shock and grief. But Maryanne managed to allay his fears, playing the role of the pious, heartbroken caregiver, mourning the terrible afflictions that were claiming their innocence. And still suspecting nothing, James Robinson married his pregnant housekeeper, and she gave birth to a daughter, Mary Isabella, 3 months later. Would she stop now that she was with husband number 3? Tragically, and one might say predictably, the answer is no. The infant fell ill and died barely 4 months old. Officially from convulsions and stomach inflammation, but probably from arsenic poisoning. At this point, James Robinson began to sense something was not quite right. 4 of his own children, his stepdaughter and mother-in-law, had died since Maryanne had entered his life in little more than a year. And now, fertile as ever, and expecting another child, his dear wife was pressuring him into taking out an insurance policy on his own life. His suspicions raised, he started to look more closely at the household accounts. To his horror, he discovered that Maryanne had been stealing from him, running up debts, and failing to pay money into the bank. She'd even sent his children to the pawnbrokers to cash in his valuables behind his back. Whether he suspected her of anything other than financial deceit is unclear, but he threw her out of his house and onto the streets after she had borne his son. Wisely, he exercised his legal rights as a husband at the time and kept custody of the child, almost certainly saving his life. After being cast out, Maryanne was for the first time in years without a home or immediate prospects. She had no job, and with the scandal of theft attached to her name, she was unlikely to get one. So, where would she go next? There is a bit of a gap in our knowledge of what happened over the next few months. She spent some time in a home for fallen women, but whether she was working or being rescued from a life on the streets is unclear. She worked briefly for a doctor whose pocket watch mysteriously went missing before ending up visiting an old friend from her teenage years in the village of Warbottle, a few miles from Newcastle. Maryanne Cotton. Margaret had a brother, Frederick, a miner who was recently widowed with 2 young sons. When Maryanne arrived on the scene, she must have seemed like a blessing from heaven, an experienced nurse, mother, and housekeeper. What more could a lonely widower ask for? The only problem was that he already had his sister looking after him and his boys. But within weeks, Maryanne Cotton fell ill with a stomach ailment. Her beautiful friend Maryanne helped out by preparing her meals. But Alice, you've guessed it. Margaret died suddenly. Maryanne then turned to comforting the grieving Frederick, and it wasn't long before she was pregnant, and Fred naturally wanted to do the honorable thing and marry her. Unbeknownst to Fred, however, there was a complication. Maryanne was still married to James Robinson. Divorce was an extremely expensive business at the time and not really an option for the working classes. But if you've already killed 2 husbands, some or all of your children, and your own mother, you're not going to worry too much about adding bigamy to your list of crimes. So, in September 1870, she went through yet another wedding ceremony and became Mrs. Maryanne Cotton, the name by which she would forever be remembered. Her extraordinary fertility continued, and early the next year, Maryanne gave birth to a son, giving her 3 young children to look after, her own infant and Fred's 2 boys. And a few months later, at Maryanne's insistence, the family moved to the village of West Auckland. What happened next followed the familiar pattern. Frederick Cotton, having taken out a life insurance policy on himself and his sons, started to become ill with stomach pains. And just over a year after their wedding, he died of gastric fever. And Maryanne trotted off to the insurance office to collect again. By now, Maryanne had rekindled her relationship with Joseph Natras, her former lover, who just so happened to be living in West Auckland as well. She persuaded Natras to move into the Cotton household, ostensibly as a lodger soon after Frederick's death. Tongues in the village would no doubt have wagged at the idea of a woman so recently widowed taking in a lodger, but Maryanne was adept at keeping up appearances and deflecting gossip. Her own infant son, Robert, and Fred's eldest son, Frederick Jr., aged about 10, both died in the spring of 1872. Then Joseph Natras, so much for being her lover, also became ill, and after altering his will in Maryanne's favor, he too succumbed to gastric fever. But she had already begun an affair with a local excise officer called John Quick Manning, by whom she was pregnant again. After Natras's death, Maryanne Cotton no doubt planned to become Mrs. Quick Manning, and I think we all know how that one would have ended. But in her haste, she became overconfident and careless. A local parish official named Thomas Riley, knowing she had previous experience as a nurse, knocked on her door to ask if she would help look after a woman who was ill with smallpox. She declined, saying she could not leave home because she had to care for her young stepson, Charles Cotton, but then casually asked Riley if he could put young Charles in the workhouse. The English workhouse system was supposed to be a way of ensuring that paupers, who had no means of supporting themselves, would be provided with accommodation, food, and gainful employment. They worked. But the workhouses that sprang up all over the country were deliberately cold and bleak to discourage the lazy from taking advantage. Only those in the most desperate circumstances would go into a workhouse. So to suggest that your 7-year-old stepson be deposited there was callous in the extreme, and not surprisingly, the parish officer was taken aback. And when he demurred, Maryanne shrugged her shoulders and uttered the chilling words that would be her undoing. "I won't be troubled long. He'll go like all the rest of the Cotton." Having got away with so many murders, was she beginning to think she was invincible? Or was there a hint of narcissistic rage in there? Having been told no by Riley, she would show him who she was, and true to her word, within a matter of days, Charles Cotton fell violently ill with stomach pains and vomiting. And despite the soothing syrup his stepmother gave him, he died just like all the others. When Riley heard, he went straight to the police, and the coroner agreed to a post-mortem and arranged an inquest. Victorian inquests were very different to those held today, hastily convened, often sitting in public houses, and quite often over and done with before the next round of drinks. Charles Cotton's inquest was no different, held the day after his death in the Rose and Crown pub next door to Maryanne's house on Front Street. The autopsy was non-specific, so the jury returned a verdict of death by natural causes, and the boy was buried. It looked like Maryanne had got away with it again. However, the local newspapers got wind of the story and started digging into Maryanne's past. They soon discovered the astonishing litany of bereavements that seemed to have followed this woman wherever she went. 3 husbands dead, a lover dead, a friend Margaret dead, her mother dead, and around a dozen children all dead, usually from the same ambiguous gastric fevers. And Riley went back to the doctor and urged him to test tissue samples from the boy for arsenic. Positive. This was the smoking gun that had long been missing. She was arrested and held in Durham jail while the quiet village of West Auckland was thrown into uproar. Gawkers surrounded the Cotton's house, peering through the windows to catch a glimpse of the scene of so many crimes. Investigators quickly arranged to exhume other bodies associated with Maryanne, and in the remains of Joseph Natris and the other Cotton children, the telltale signs of arsenic poisoning were found. Maryanne, meanwhile, coolly protested her innocence, claiming that Riley had made advances that she rejected, so he had falsely accused her out of spite. Few believed her. After languishing in a cell for months, she gave birth to her 13th child, Margaret. Much luckier than the others, as she was taken away and put up for adoption and lived into old age, only dying in the 1950s. Just one of the 2 that survived her mother's cruel attentions. Her trial for the murder of 7-year-old Charles Cotton began at Durham Assizes in March 1873. The prosecution focused on the murder of her stepson Charles, as it was the clearest case with hard forensic facts. But evidence of the other suspicious deaths was introduced to establish a pattern and motive. This was crucial. Even though Maryanne was formally charged with only 1 murder, the jury heard about Natris's arsenic-laced corpse and the other exhumed Cotton children with poison in them, as well as the endless procession of prior family deaths. Maryanne pleaded not guilty. Her defense team argued that little Charles had died accidentally from absorbing arsenic from the green wallpaper. As implausible as this sounds, it was known that damp conditions could cause arsenic in wallpaper to release toxic fumes. And it has been suggested that Napoleon Bonaparte died as a result of the Parisian green in his wallpaper on his faraway prison island of St. Helena. Her defense team also suggested that Maryanne might have used arsenic-containing products to wash the floors or clothes, and that Charles could have been accidentally poisoned. They painted Maryanne as an unfortunate woman around whom arsenic was present for entirely legitimate reasons, not for malicious intent. The prosecution, however, told a simpler story. Maryanne had systematically and deliberately dosed Charles with arsenic to get him out of the way, to collect an insurance payout, and to free herself to marry Quick Manning. The Victorian public was riveted by the trial. Courtroom sketches in newspapers depicted Maryanne Cotton as a stern, plain-looking woman in a black dress and bonnet, betraying little emotion. And those present in court noted that she maintained a stony composure throughout the proceedings, shedding no tears as the list of those she had lost was read out one by one. After a deliberation of just 90 minutes, the jury returned a verdict: guilty of murder. There was only one possible sentence. The judge would have donned his black cap to deliver the fateful words: "You are sentenced to death by hanging." Only then did her facade crack. The Times reported after her conviction, the unfortunate woman appeared to be overwhelmed with emotion, which for a time replaced her usual coldness and reserve. She is convinced that she will be granted a royal pardon and resolutely maintains her innocence of the crime for which she has been convicted. Many convicted women in that era did plead for mercy, and some were spared the gallows and allowed to live out their lives in prison. In Maryanne's case, though no pardon came, awaiting the appointed day in Durham jail, she continued to maintain her innocence, and she wrote letters to those who still supported her, reminiscing about how happy she had been in her childhood, but never confessing to any of the murders. On the morning of March 24, 1873, Maryanne Cotton was led to the scaffold in the prison. The hangman was William Calcraft, Britain's longest serving and most prolific executioner, famous for his short drop method, which often resulted in the condemned dying slowly. He was well known to the Victorian public, and several unofficial biographies of him appeared, supposedly revealing all his gory details. As usual in Maryanne's case, Calcraft's rope was too short, and she was left writhing and jerking for several minutes until Calcraft finished her off by pressing on her shoulders. Thus ended the life of Maryanne Cotton. She was buried in the prison yard immediately after. She may have been gaunt, but her dark legend was only just beginning. Dubbed the Black Widow of Durham or the Dark Angel, there are several books about her, and she became known as Britain's first female serial killer, a sinister predator who preyed on her own family. Strictly speaking, as she was only convicted of one murder, she should not be placed in that category. But the tests showed that there were at least 3 more. We'll never know the exact body count, but if the 21 possible cases are all included in her tally, she remains Britain's most prolific female serial killer, and the notoriety of her case had a lasting impact. It highlighted how easily the symptoms of arsenic poisoning could be misidentified as natural causes, and the authorities became more aware of the importance of conducting thorough inquests, especially when multiple deaths struck a family. Her trial was also a triumph for the emerging power of forensic science and the chemical testing for arsenic. From a psychological perspective, there has been much speculation as to the motives that drove Maryanne Cotton to her crimes. She was clearly intelligent, organized, and extraordinarily bold. Her poisonings may have spanned 20 years or more, during which she hoodwinked doctors, neighbors, husbands, and insurance companies into thinking she was just a poor, unfortunate woman. Some argue that Maryanne was a product of her times, that extreme poverty and the limited rights of women pushed her into murder simply as a means of survival. But I don't find this convincing. There were plenty of women who were worse off than Maryanne Cotton who did not choose the same path. Some suggest the trauma of her father's death and the manner of his being brought home and deposited on the kitchen table hardened her heart and convinced her that life was cheap. But for me, it seems likely that she was a psychopath, superficially charming but deceitful, calculating and lacking in empathy, treating human lives as mere obstacles to be removed if they got in her way. Psychopathy is a term that has changed meaning significantly over the years. In the 19th century, it meant any mental disorder, but it gradually came to be applied to those exhibiting antisocial behaviors and criminality, and especially in the popular imagination serial killers. I think Maryanne Cotton was probably a psychopath who killed those around her to pursue her own selfish ends. But how many there were and what she thought about her deeds, we'll never know. Why she was a psychopath? Now that is a big question. Modern neurobiological research has shown structural and functional abnormalities in a number of key brain areas in psychopaths, along with deficits in emotional processing. But the interpretation and validity of these findings is hotly disputed. And like every other form of human behavior, we are still trying to understand what makes some people do things that others wouldn't. Her dark legacy endures in crime history as a cautionary tale. She reminds us that dangerous people are not always the rampaging monsters of horror films. They can just as easily be the smiling figure offering a spoonful of soothing syrup. If you'd like to know more about the dark deeds of Maryanne Cotton, then I would recommend David Wilson's book. He is a respected criminologist well known for his work on serial killers. There is also a chilling dramatization of her life, Dark Angel, some of which was filmed at the Beamish Museum, which houses, amongst happier items, some of Maryanne Cotton's final letters and the teapot in which she mixed her poisonous brews. As always, I would love to hear your views and any suggestions you may have for future topics. But apart from that, I will say goodbye for now.